Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to welcome you to the KLA Conference Impact Room. My name is Holly Ray, and I am with the Hayes Public Library. I am pleased to introduce Andrew Smith, who is an associate professor at Emporia State, and Robin Newell, who is the director of Emporia Public. And this is their presentation entitled Effective Policy Evaluation and Creation, a Practical Approach. So I will let the presenters take it away.
Thank you, Holly.
Oh, and I'm starting, sorry. Sorry,
Good.
Robin and I have been doing a double act all day and I forgot that I was to start this one. So my sad thing is I have to work the slides as well. So first little thing is, who are we? Holly has just introduced us. I want to say Robin has another role at the moment as president of KLA for a few more hours, I think. And then I also serve as the board chair of the Emporia Public Library, so I work very closely with Robin on policy and all sorts of things, which is why we are here. So why are we here? You need strong policies because those ensure smooth library operation. Policies provide protection from unreasonable behavior on all kinds of people's parts. And situations change, so policies must change too. And inadequate or non-existent policies leave staff and board vulnerable. So those are the four things we would say is why we're really here to talk about policy today and policy evaluation. But of course, the question is, how do you create good policy? And so the first thing is, what actually provokes policy? Why do you, how do you end up with policy? And the first thing is there are some legal requirements. So there are legal requirements for public libraries to have policies on the protection of children on the internet. It is not an option, you must have it. You may also have legal requirements to do with weapons that would require you to have a policy. You need policy for basic library operations. How does somebody get a library card? Who gets a library card? How do things circulate? So those are basic things where you just need some sort of understanding of what's going on. You need policy to deal with unreasonable behavior. So you need a code of conduct or some sort that will govern what you are saying is acceptable and unacceptable in your library building. You also probably should have policy to do with the internet and usage of computers, which could be things that you would not want people doing on your computers in public spaces, or simply how much time somebody can spend on a computer at once. Other ideas like diversity, equity, and inclusion. So what does your collection development policy say about materials and about collecting opposing viewpoints of materials? And then meeting rooms. Who can use your meeting rooms? Can anybody, or is it only certain people? So those are the things that would provoke policy. And if you were with us this morning, we had our little policy primer there as well, talking about the board, but we're going to say it again because it is absolutely crucial. The board of directors of your library is responsible for adopting written policies to govern the operation of the library. And this is Kansas state law. And then the board is responsible for hiring the library director. The library director hires and manages staff, and the staff develop procedures to implement policy. Notice, even at this early stage, we have separated out the policy itself from the procedures used to implement it. And we'll talk more about that slightly later. So I know that. But how do I do it? So let's be a little practical here. Robin, I hope you're taking over here.
All right. One of the things I wanted to add to what Andrew just said is like written policy. If the policy is just in your head or in your board's head or floating around out there somewhere in the air, it's not a policy. A policy has to be written down. It has to be approved by the board. So those are two really important points that I want to make just before we get started. So,
and Robin, just before you do, there is no such thing as an unwritten rule. An unwritten rule is a wish.
there you go.
So anytime you get into policy problems, the answer to all your problems is referring to a written policy. And should you be unfortunate enough for people to be doing wicked things to you in the courts, courts are not going to look at the policy itself so much as to whether you had a policy and whether you followed it. So it's important that you have something written down and that is what you follow. Just before Robin jumps on in, if, by the way, you have a policy that you purposefully don't follow because it is no longer correct or useful, you are in a very dangerous position because you are not following your own policy and you're saying you're not following your own policy. Change the policy. It is yours. You are the people who made it. You are the people who can change it. You can change it at any time for any reason, but you make it work for you. Sorry,
and that's the board's responsibility. That's part of their job. So they should be working on policies at every board meeting. They should be reviewing policies. They should be discussing policies. So let's just start about you. The first thing to do is to review the policies that you have on hand. What policies do you already have? Make that list. The next thing you do is say, how old are these policies? When was the last time that you looked at these policies or that the board looked at the policies? Are these policies any good? You know, do you have staff complaining that the policies are just too hard to implement? You know, we can't make these policies work. They're not realistic. There's no way we can implement these policies as a staff. And then what is missing? What policies do you have that are missing? An example would be right now we have a couple of finance policies. We have a gift and memorial policy, and we have a capital outlay policy. But what we have decided in the last couple of months we really need is a comprehensive, overarching finance policy that addresses every one of those issues in one policy. So think about not only what you have, but what you might be missing. And then talk about what is essential. What policies do you need in that library to, again, protect the library and to protect your staff? What is desirable? You know, right now I would really desire an animal policy. That's in my to-do list. I really would like to have some type of animal policy that would be very clear cut so that we would know what to tell people. Whether that's essential or not, probably not, but it's something that I totally desire. So are they policies or do they include procedure? And I think that Andrew will talk about that a little more later. That's one of his passions is this policy or is this procedure? And he's really good at it as a library board chair. But we really talk about that in the policy committee when the policy committee is looking at our policies and reviewing our policies is this policy or is this how the policy is supposed to be implemented, which would be the procedure.
So the point then is what makes a good policy? And you really want your policy to be clear, unambiguous. You also want it to be concise. I think the last 3 years ago when we were going through the collection development policy, Robin, remind me, was it 20 pages or 30 pages?
Oh, it was ridiculous. It was over 30 pages when I came 6 years ago. I mean, it was a gigantic document.
So it's now 6,
yeah.
I think. because there was bunches of procedure in there. And also there was an awful lot of stuff that was obviously something happened, one single thing happened, and somebody wrote some quote policy to cope with that one situation and stuck it into the collection development policy. And so you had this accrual of single incident policy reactions, which is never a good way to do it. Does your policy fit your library's needs and situation? There are fabulous policies out there that other libraries have that may simply not be right for you, not because they're bad policies, but just because that library operates a totally different way in a completely different situation. So make sure when you're looking at policy that it fits you and it serves your library's needs in your situation. Make sure that it meets requirements. And by that, I'm talking both about legal requirements. So for example, the Children's Internet Protection Act, or operational requirements. Robin's already referred to this. If something is unworkable, it is not a good policy. Fix it so that it is able to be implemented, because otherwise you're going to have frustrated patrons, frustrated staff, and that's not where you want to be. You want to make sure that a good policy is consistent with other policies. You don't want this continual, oh, it says something over in this policy, but it says exactly the opposite in this policy here. Your policies must be consistent across the board. Now, it doesn't happen overnight. It takes time to go through this and work it out. So that's something we haven't said yet. Nobody's policy is perfect. The Emporia Public Library has a whole policy page. You are more than welcome to go there and look at our policy. You are absolutely welcome to borrow anything that works for you, but please understand, we are not saying these are the best policies or the only policies. We're saying these are policies that work for us, that we've been working on fairly consistently for several years now. And so we are confident that we are moving in the right direction. And then finally, is your policy actually a policy and not procedure? Procedure is how you implement policy. So for example, if you have a policy about meeting rooms that says anybody in the community can have them, but nobody can use your meeting rooms for commercial purposes, so I can't have a jewelry sale in your meeting rooms, that's fine, that's policy. How you book a meeting room, if the staff say we need people to book in advance, or we want people to be able to book in advance, and we have a system where you phone the library or you send us an email and we'll do that, or you can walk in off the street, that's fine. The board doesn't care and shouldn't care about that. That's not the policy. That is simply how the library staff have determined is the best, fairest way for them to allocate meeting room space. If there's a problem, it comes back to the policy, but implementation is the library director's job, assisted by his or her staff. And that stuff, get all that language out of your policy, which is not to say that you shouldn't have written procedures for accomplishing certain tasks. It's helpful for the library staff. It's helpful when you're transitioning from one staff person to another, but that should be able to be changed easily as circumstances change. So for example, if something changes when there is a pandemic about workflow, that's not a policy issue. You fix that yourselves as the librarians. You're the smart people there. It's not a policy issue. The board doesn't have to review that. But be very careful in your policy statements that you stop the policy at the point where you've given the overarching conditions for whatever it is you're going to do, and leave the how we implement that to the staff. So I guess I'll do this one too, Robin. Here are my policy evaluation questions. So when I'm reading a policy, what does the policy actually say? And when I say that, I mean interpret everything literally. Don't assume that this is what the writer meant. What does it actually say? Because that's what people are going to hold you to. And is what the policy literally says what you want? You decide, it's up to you. If it is what you want, wonderful. If it's not what you want, you need to change it. What does the policy imply? Or are there unwanted implications? So for example, if you only mention one type of item, so for example, if you only mention books, does that mean that whatever you've said only applies to books? And does that automatically exclude DVDs, databases, any other kind of materials you might have? Be on the lookout for those types of things where use language that encompasses, for example, the whole of your library patrons or the whole of your collection. Next thing, is the language clear and unambiguous? Is it as clear and concise as we can make it? That is very often a process of letting people read it and talk to each other to decide, to say, what does this mean to you? If it means something totally different than what I thought when I wrote it, we need to change it. And we work together on that. And then the last thing is it really a policy? Does it lay out a principle of action for the library? Robin, talk to this, please.
Okay, so these are policy evaluation questions continued. The other thing that you want to look at is, does this policy conflict with any other existing policy? And this is where you want to really look at your policies as a whole. And if there's something like, so for instance, if you have a gift and memorial policy and in your collection development policy, it refers to books that are donated and how those will be taken into the collection, you want to make sure that your gift and memorial policy and your collection development policy have the same language in them, so that there's not any conflicting any conflicting information. So you may need to edit both of those policies at the same time, or at least have both of those policies in front of the board or your policy committee at the same time, so that they're aware that they're related policies. But try to keep each policy within its own sphere. You don't want to really have a mashup. You really want to have the policies separate. Is the policy similar to an existing policy? And again, that's what I was talking about earlier, where we were talking about we have a couple of finance policies, but they all need to be under one finance policy. So make sure that you don't have, and I'm trying to think of a good example here, an emergency closing policy and then an emergency weather policy. Those are too similar, and the emergency weather policy can probably be addressed under the emergency closing policy. And then the other thing to think about is do we need this policy at all? You know, is it covered by another policy? Was this a policy that's left over from years ago, as Andrew was talking about, where a situation happened and the board had kind of not that they would do anything like that, a knee-jerk reaction and decided, oh, we've got to pass this policy for whatever reason. So really look at, do you need that policy at all?
And Robin, our example of that would be our cell phone policy, which we have done away with because we realized it was covered under our code of conduct policy.
Correct.
There was no need for a separate, we understand why back when cell phones were coming in and people were being incredibly annoying with them, there was a separate policy. But 20 years later, causing a disturbance is actually covered under the code of conduct. So we didn't need a separate policy. And then policy creation process. Robin, you talk about this as well, please.
So in most circumstances, the library director drafts the policy. And whether that's a new policy or whether that is a review situation. So I will get the policy first, and I will do some type of editing on my own and put a draft together for the board. I will look for all kinds of help there. I will go to other libraries' websites. I will go to the regional library systems wikis. I will look all over the place, because there are so many different types of policies that I want to make sure that whatever I'm giving to the board is something that I've really thought out. It's kind of like getting quotes for prices for something. I mean, you just want to go out and kind of shop around and see what there is there. So I'll do the draft, and when I have a draft done, then I will take it to the staff, especially if this is a brand new policy. It will go to the staff first for their input. If it's a revision, again, it will definitely go to the staff as far as circulation policy, because they're going to have to look at this policy and be able to implement it. So, and there's been a couple of times where, especially in a circulation policy, it's like, Robin, this doesn't really work anymore. This is based on our old library software that we use for our catalog. And so things have changed. So the staff really help you clean up and focus that policy. And then in Emporia, it goes to a policy subcommittee. We have a standing policy committee that works all the time on policy review and policy development. We'll get their input on it. When we get a good draft that comes out of the policy committee, then it goes to the board for a first reading. It may pass that time, and it may be sent back to the committee. It just depends on what the policy is, whether it's a review situation or a new one. But it's a really collaborative process with the entire organization, clear about what we want to do, clear about what the boundaries of this policy are, so that as Andrew said earlier, there's always gray areas, but we really want something that we can fall back on and to be able to point to our policy and say, look, this is why it is this way. We have a policy, and it was approved by our board, and this is the way we do things, at least in Emporia. So then it gets presented to the board for approval. Again, don't be scared to rework it. It can go back and forth to the policy committee as many times as it needs to. It just needs to be continually worked on and kind of, and that's where the director comes in again, is just like kind of move it through that committee and move it through the board. And then once it's approved, it's implemented and it's publicized. We put all of our policies on our website. They are all communicated to the staff as soon as they're approved. It goes out in the board packet, of course, to all of our board members, and then it's actually posted up on our webpage.
Notice, Robin, let me just jump in. There may also be requirements for certain things where you must post them physically in your library as well. So just be aware, again, that those would be things where it'd be very clear that things have to be posted in your library, as well as on the web page. I love this, beg, steal, or borrow. So much of the time, I think we're looking, and particularly smaller libraries, you're saying, I don't have a lot of time. How do I even start this? Beg, steal, and borrow. Look at similar libraries. Do they have a policy? Read it. Is it any good? Does it fit your situation? Can you adapt it? All of those are absolutely fine to do. We're librarians. Has anybody ever asked a librarian to share a policy and been told no? Haven't heard of that yet. So ask colleagues, ask everybody, go look. Look to the state library or other, the regional library associations and whatnots. Very often they're very helpful with requirements, with templates, with examples. I will put my one little caveat in here. Robin will be laughing. When she sent me the state library template for the Child Internet Protection Act policy, I read it and said, this is nice, but it actually isn't a policy. And I checked 2 or 3 days ago, and I think the state library example is still not a policy. It does not actually, it tells you everything about it, but you can put your name into that as many times as you like. But that is not a policy, I don't think, because it does not actually commit the library to doing a single thing. So just beware that just because something is on a website does not mean it actually is good, right, true, just, or anything else. That was just my little thing there. It's very often helpful to think about policy in these, as a 3-section document, if you like. And the first thing is an introduction or a preamble, and it just gives the context of the policy. Why does it exist? If you're dealing with something that's using a lot of terminology, for example, our gift and memorial policy is referencing restricted gifts, unrestricted gifts. There's 2 other terms we use. Have a definitions section at the beginning so that everybody understands the context in which this policy exists, if there's unusual terminology, what everything means, and then your policy statement. Every policy won't need that. There will be some things that just won't need that much there. But if you have something that is a little bit more complex or that you're a little bit less sure of, split it into these 3 sections, and it's very easy, I think, or it's much easier in this context to write about why do we need this? And then what is the terminology we're using? And then what is our actual policy statement? And Robin.
Keep it simple, please. I will tell you this last week I was struggling. We are rewriting a whole article of our bylaws, and I was trying to start wordsmithing that, and I worked on it for a short period of time, and then thought, you know, there's probably another set of bylaws out there for a public library that has all of this information written in a clear and concise manner that somebody has already done. And so I did. I went out and I found one that was very simple and straightforward, and cut and copied that, and that is what we're going to be using in our policy committee. So if you can find it out there, if it will work for your library, keep it simple, not just even in the writing of it, but in the process for you. But you want to keep it simple and straightforward, because you're going to have to explain. Let me rephrase it. You may have to explain this policy to an individual who is not a board member, who is not a library staff person, who may never have been in a library before, but they're going to come in and there's going to be a situation, and you're going to have to say, sorry, our policy, and then they're going to say, well, you need to tell me about what this is and how it is and all. And you as a library director or a library staff person is going to have to be able to explain that. So you want to keep it simple. Again, don't include the procedure or the implementation. Use that 3-part format if it's helpful. And like Andrew said, some of our policies don't fit that 3-part, but the gift and memorial specifically does, because we have different types of accounts. Consider similar policies together. Again, that's that we talked about the gift and memorial and the collection development policy, and talked about an overarching finance policy where we're going to put capital outlay under there, or credit card policy, you know, anything that has to do with finances, but just group those together. And then refer to our own policy for consistency in language, structure, design, and format. So that's part of my job, is before that even goes to the policy committee, I take that draft and I put it in the correct format. It's got the same heading on it. It says the same thing on every one of our policies. the format is the same, the text is the same, so that there's a cohesive, clear look when you're looking at those policies.
And again, this is not something that you do overnight. So if you're looking at your policy at the moment and you think it's, how can I put this nicely? It's a bit of a jumble. Don't feel bad. We've all been there. Start at the beginning, start one policy at a time. And quite often, it's much easier to begin with something very simple, particularly if your board is not particularly used to doing this. Start with something simple and straightforward that you can accomplish quickly and successfully, and everyone will gain confidence. You also want to create a policy review calendar. You want to review every policy periodically. Now, notice we're saying review. We're not saying rewrite, we're saying review. Some policies, for example, we'll come back to Children's Internet Protection Act, have a mandatory 3-year review. So by law, you must re-examine that policy and re-up every 3 years. Other policies probably won't need to change. None of the policies may need to change every 3 years, but it's not unreasonable to look at them at least every 3 years or sooner. The pandemic caused us to do some changes in our circulation policy just because we wanted people to have a little bit more time, because it was rather more restrictive getting items in and out of the library. And we thought we'll be fine if we just change this to a 4-week checkout period rather than 3. Here's the other thing: encourage the board and staff to suggest policy changes as needs arise. Again, it's your policy. You can change it. And remember that policy should serve your library population. It's not there to be a barrier. It's there to be a tool to help you succeed. And have we said this often enough? Keep procedure out of your policy documents. We include approval statements on all of our policy, and there's 2 reasons for that. First of all, including the date when it was approved reminds us of the last time it was done. I personally don't care for this, first approved on this date and then include every other date. It's enough simply to say this was approved. Even if you've looked at it and said we're not making any changes, the library board approves it on November 1st, 2020. I think November 1st is the only date you need. But the other thing is the authority is it's approved by the library board. So that if anyone's looking at this policy, it's not just the director or it's not just the front desk staff who've made something up. This is the library board. They have legal obligations. In Emporia, they are appointed by the city. This is part of their statutory obligation. Here it is documented for you. So authority and date. We've talked about structure and design. Look for changes in one policy that might necessitate changes in another. When we're actually reviewing our collection policy at the moment because it's at its 3-year limit. At one point, it refers to the gift and memorial policy, and there's nothing wrong with the gift and memorial policy, but as I read the 2 together, I realized the gift and memorial policy actually doesn't say anything about gifts of items that are intended for the collection. So we understand that our collection policy applies to everything, but because of how we'd written the collection policy, and the collection policy was written under an older version of gifts and memorials, but this is how easy it is for these to come adrift. And they're not seriously apart. We just need to insert one line in the collections policy that says, collections policy applies to, all materials, whether gifted or purchased, end of story. but there are these things that come up. Another thing is we had a policy on display of materials. We had a different policy on exhibitions. We had a different policy on
Bulletin boards.
bulletin boards and display cases. All of those used slightly different language. And so you could look across the three of them and you could say, so this is allowed here and here, but not in the one in the middle, which really wasn't the intent at all. So when we were looking at those, we looked at them all together and we made the language consistent across all of those. So everything to doing with displaying, whether it's an exhibition, whether it's a notice on the bulletin board, whether it's something in the display cases, has the same language now. The other thing to remember is just because you review it doesn't mean you have to change it. We're also on the docket for this year is our request for reconsideration. And I just read that yesterday and said, that's clean. We really did a good job last time. I wouldn't change a single word of that. So that will be fine. That will go to the board, and unless there are any complaints, that will be reapproved. The 2020 date will go on, and that'll be good for another 3 years, unless there is a need to change it in the interim. Before we go into our top 20 policies, Robin, because we actually are coming down to 2 minutes before our 10 minutes for questions, would you like to say something before we jump in here?
Yes, I would. Thank you. I want to talk a little bit about directors' responsibility for writing policies and the whole review process. It can be overwhelming when you're looking at 20 or 30 policies. When I came into this position, I had policies that had not been reviewed since 1999. That was I've been here 6 years. So, I mean, there were policies that really needed some work. And it was kind of overwhelming to look at how are we going to do this? And then I thought about the old joke about, how do you eat an elephant? And you eat an elephant one bite at a time. And that's what I really want to encourage directors to think about is you don't have to do this all at once. Take one policy and start one policy, but make yourself a library calendar where when you do your board agendas and just kind of work those policies into those agendas for you, so that you've got kind of a heads up when I know that, for instance, the gift and memorial policy is coming up for review. That will be something that I'll be pushing out to the board. That'll be something that I'll be putting on an agenda. So I already have a year's worth of plan on how I'm going to get those policies reviewed by the board. So just take a little bit of time and a little bit of planning, and it'll make it a lot easier in the long run.
I think the other thing there, Robin, is, if your policy is not perfect, it didn't get this way overnight. And so you're not going to fix it overnight. And that's fine. It's, to be honest, Robin started this. I came on the board a year after you came, Robin, 2 years
Yes.
after you came. But it was interesting because we just redid the gift and memorial policy this summer, and it had been done, first of all, the year before I came on the board, and I read it and said, well, this is interesting. Just out of interest, it doesn't actually, the word memorial does not occur in the policy other than in the title. So how did that happen? But there were also some things that it turned out that two policies had sort of been mashed together in a last minute motion by the board. And you had things in the gift and memorial policy, and it's not that the particular items were wrong, they just were completely inappropriate in that policy. So even if you do it, you might not get it right the first time, and that's okay. But the point is, you simply start working on it. Robin and I talked this morning about board recruitment and board responsibility. The largest part of the board responsibility is creating policy. So that should be a major part of your board meetings is this idea of policy. Producing this policy and asking people to work on it also helps them understand much more clearly what the library is, how the library operates, and what their responsibilities are as far as the operations of the library and their statutory responsibilities to the state library and to the state of Kansas.
And I wouldn't hesitate to add too, if you have the kind of relationship with your city attorney, or if the library has their own attorney, if you have any legal questions about a policy, I wouldn't hesitate to go to the attorney or to go to an HR consultant. I'll give you an example. We just did our employee handbook, which took us almost a year, a couple of years ago, actually about 2 years ago. 2018, as a matter of fact, August 9th. I can still remember the date. We approved that one. But it's okay to go out and ask for consultation through the regional library systems, or hire an HR consultant, or your city attorney or another attorney if you have questions that you really feel are need to be addressed by someone who knows more than I do.
I've actually taken down the PowerPoint. There are a lot more slides to do with different policies. The PowerPoint is available to you in the handouts area at the top, in the link at the top. But at the moment, we'd like to answer any questions you have or respond to any questions. And the question is the sheet covering up his massive shelves of books? No, it isn't. It's covering up some cabinets that have doors that have lines, and there's no way for me to sit in front of them without having lines coming out of my ears and out of the middle of my head, which you don't want to do. So that's why I have my sheet behind me, beautifully ironed, I hope you know. And there we are. How much time is typical for public comments? You mean in the board meeting, Melanie?
Yes, I think that's what she's talking about. I think ours is 3 to 5 minutes, but our policy is on our website. We have a public comment policy.
Yes, we do. And also the policy says you can't comment on anything that isn't on the agenda. So it has to be related to the agenda. It's not just a free-for-all. And we're not trying to stifle involvement in the library, but we all know that people can be overly talkative if not given a framework.
We actually have, and they have to fill out a public comment card before they can even speak. So they are allowed to speak. There's no direct interaction with the board members. They get to come and present something. And then it's thank you very much. The board will take that under consideration, and then they're done. But it's not a time for an open conversation necessarily with the board.
Right. And part of that is the board should not be, first of all, the board should not be making pronouncements without thinking through and studying whatever the issue is. And secondly, any public comments should come from the designated people who are going to do that, either the board chair or the library director as appropriate. And so that's what we do. You create that policy. Somebody asked us this morning how long a board meeting should be. If you're having them monthly, as we do, there are certain amounts of business that you simply must accomplish. For example, the approving financial reports. And even when we do policy work, because we have a policy subcommittee, a lot of the nitty-gritty gets done outside of the board meeting. So we don't have wordsmithing in the board meeting. All that happens outside. The board gets a pretty polished product, or we get a pretty polished product with a specific question for the board. Now, the board are entitled to ask any questions they like, but if we go in and say, here's what we're proposing, and of course they will have seen it in advance, but here's a question for you. The policy committee thinks this, but we want to make sure that this is in agreement, that the whole board understands this particular part in particular and is in agreement.
And again, I always make myself available. If board members have policy review questions or they aren't sure, for instance, the latest one was, I don't understand why the library closing policy has anything to do with the school closing policy, which, you know, that was a valid question, but it just gives you an opportunity to explain that instead of having to do it in a board meeting when you have 8 people sitting there with valuable time, when only one person needed the information.
Yeah. There's 2 questions. Let me do the second one first. Are committee meetings considered public meetings? Well, if they are, Robin, what's the state ruling on that?
You can't have a quorum.
You can't have a quorum.
You
So
cannot have a quorum. You can have, that's why our committees have two board members on it. The president is ex officio and I am ex officio on every committee. So we have basically three board members on every committee. But they are not considered under coma unless there is a quorum. And if I'm incorrect here, then let me know.
But we actually attended the open meetings workshop 3 years ago.
Yes.
Put on by the State Attorney General's office. So that's where we got that. And then the other question, Audrey says, our policies have each board member's signature on them. Do they need to sign every policy or just say approved by the board and the date? Gee, that really sounds like there was some issue at some point where, you know, well, I'm not signing, you know. We have a quorum. We have eight people on the board. 5 is a quorum. We follow Robert's Rules of Order, so a policy could be accepted by majority vote. I can't think of anything that we've ever approved except unanimously. Robin, can you think of anything that we?
No, I can't, but I do think that if a policy is approved, in your board minutes, it should say motion to approve the policy blah, and here was the vote.
Yeah.
So if there are people that are voting against, it will be noted in the minutes. And I don't think personally, I've never seen people board members signing policy.
That would be rather, that's very much one of those instances where you think there was a situation at some time,
right,
that provoked that particular practice. And I'm not sure that that's reasonable. Even if it's recorded in the minutes, Robin, it won't record the name of somebody that voted against or who abstained. It would just say there were 5 votes in favor, 2 votes against, and 1 abstention. So yeah, that seems a little bit more. And the other thing is, if it's approved by the board in the board meeting, that's in the minutes, it's done. It is the policy. It doesn't matter if somebody didn't vote for it or voted against it. They're entitled to tell everybody they wanted, but it shouldn't be on the policy. That seems a little weird, but I don't know the particular situation. I think there will be a story behind that, as there very often is behind a lot of policy.
I would ask, is there a policy that, does the board have a policy that, or is it in their bylaws that those policies have to be signed? I mean, there's got to be some kind of like something there that says that.
Yeah.
And if there's not that, then it's just procedure that has turned into a rule.
Right. We in fact, the board chair and the secretary sign the approved minutes of meetings. And so that's where you would find a signature that authorized something, but not on the actual policy document itself. And I'm sorry, we're down there we're right at the time. The board president, well, even if you count me as a board member in a committee meeting, we are still not quorate. We need to have 5 people in Emporia, 5 board members for a quorum. Robin is on the board, but as a non-voting member out of virtue of being the library director. So she is not counted in the quorum. So the quorum is, there are 8 board members plus Robin essentially on our board. A quorum is 5. Every committee is 3 board members plus the chair ex officio. So even if you count all of us as board members, there are only 4 of us. Robin makes 5, but she's not part of the quorum because she's not voting. So we are below the Emporia Public Library quorum. So that's why that would be not a public meeting. Great question. You've been asked by auditors on some things. I guess the minutes are your legal record of what actions the board took. You should not need anything beyond the minutes. So there we are. We're absolutely at our time. We very much thank you for your attention. Robin's email, my email, they're on the presentation. If you have questions, comments, feel free to ask us. We are not experts. We've just done a lot of this and we are learning as we go. And so we're happy to share our learning with you. Robin?
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you both so much.
Thanks, Holly, for superintending our session.
Of course.
Thank you, Holly.
Have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you.